Heavy naval guns now joined in the landing operations. The weak units on the coast were apparently already involved in fierce fighting. Soon after came the order, the battalion is attached to von Luck's combat group and will move off at once in the direction of Troarn, about 12 kilometers east of Caen. By making full use of cover we reached the area just west of Troarn in the early afternoon more or less without interference. Lance Corporal Hamel. Later, as we moved forward to the northeast we saw toward midday on the 6th of June 2 Messerschmitt fighters flying north low over the Orne, the only German aircraft that day. East of Caen lay the first British paratroops to be killed. From their parachute silk we cut ourselves scarves as protection against the dust. Our commander's deputy gave us the order to attack. We went into the attack practically from the march. Further west we could hear the sounds of battle. That, we heard, was where our armored group was supposed to attack. The enemy was apparently concentrating his naval fire against this, for him, dangerous thrust. His air force was also in action there. So we made good progress as far as the outskirts of Fiscoval, hence only a few kilometers from Randville and the two bridges over the Orne. In the early morning of the 6th of June the situation and issuing of orders in face of the airborne landings, the armada of warships, merchantmen and landing craft, and the incipient landing from the sea were more than confusing. Despite the supposed general directive, we had not received permission to attack during the night. Feuchtinger, even in the early morning, did not receive clearance for his division to counterattack. The commander-in-chief West von Rundstedt was of the opinion, as was Hitler's high command, that this was a diversionary maneuver. The real landing was expected in the Pas de Calais. Our corps commander, on the other hand, General Marx, thought the landing was genuine. Rommel, we heard, was en route to his HQ, without having met Hitler. So the night and first hours of the 6th of June went by. Too late, much too late, was how it seemed to us. We were dismayed and angry that we had not been believed by the highest authority. In the middle of our movements, which were constantly harassed by British planes, came a new order, this time from the 7th Army. The bulk of the 21st Panzer Division will attack the enemy forces that have landed west of the Ohm. Only elements of von Luck's combat group will attack the bridgehead east of the Orne. This involved time and further losses from air attacks. The regrouping of the division took hours. Most of the units, from the area east of Caen and the Orne, had to squeeze through the eye of the needle at Caen and over the only bridges available in this sector. Caen was under virtually constant bombardment from the Navy and the fighter bombers of the RAF. Feuchtinger informed me that an armored group, including my battalion in SPWS Schützenpanzerwagen, armored personnel carriers, was to push through to the coast west of the Orne. His orders to me: you will attack with your 2 battalion, reinforced by Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 21 and Assault Gun Battalion 200 Major Becker and a platoon of 8.8 cm anti-tank guns, east of the Orne. Your task is to crush the 6th Airborne Bridgehead, recapture the 2 Orne bridges at Bénouville and establish contact with the coastal units. Elements of artillery will support you. Start of the attack, as soon as all elements have reached you. The employment of the Reconnaissance Battalion worried me greatly. I had after all seen action in all the theaters of war as an armored scout, always as the spearhead of the division. We were not equipped for direct attacking operations. No. 4 Company of the Panzer Regiment arrived toward 1700 hours on the 6th of June, Major Becker's batteries not until the night of the 7th of June. So I had to start without them. My battalion was engaged in heavy defensive fighting against the paratroops that had landed, who were obviously trying to extend their as yet very small bridgehead. I could free only limited elements of the battalion for the attack. In the late afternoon, almost at the same time as the armored group west of the Orne, we set off. Our goal, to push through via Esquivel-Herouvelet to Randville and the 2 Ohm bridges. The Reconnaissance Battalion went straight into the attack from its march and, supported by the Panzer Company, penetrated to Esquivel against their surprised opponents. Then all hell broke loose. The heaviest naval guns, up to 38 centimeters in caliber, artillery, and fighter bombers plastered us without pause. Radio contacts were lost, wounded came back, and the men of the Reconnaissance Battalion were forced to take cover. I had gone up with the attack and saw the disaster. I managed to run forward to the commander of the battalion and gave him fresh orders. To avoid further heavy losses, break off the attack at once and take up defensive positions on the southern edge of Esquivel. set up a line of defense there and prevent any further enemy advance. Number 4 Company of the Panzer Regiment, as well as Major Becker's assault guns, when they get here, will support you. See that your men, and also the crews of the armored cars, dig themselves in. I ran back to my regiment's radio station. My adjutant, Liebskind, had to report the breaking off of the attack to division. At the same time Fought.the sent word that the armored group had reached the coast through the gap between the landed elements of the British 3rd Infantry Division and the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. Heavy fire from the Navy, relays of attacks by fighter bombers and, in the rear of the armored group, newly landed paratroops had forced them to withdraw, to avoid being encircled. My sister regiment, 192, had taken up a defensive position at about the same level as us. Now the very thing Rommel had feared had happened. The enemy had not been attacked by our whole division and thrown back into the sea in the first hours of the landing. The other 2 panzer divisions were lying in areas far to the rear. Of the 1,000 fighters that Göring had promised, nothing was to be seen. Now, on the evening of the 6th of June, it seemed to have become clear even to Hitler that it must be a matter of a large-scale invasion. But, as Fought.the told us, Hitler and his high command still reckoned on a further landing in the Pas-de-Calais. The panzer divisions and reserve units stationed there were not to be withdrawn, on express orders from Hitler. At the same time it was also clear to the last man that the invasion had succeeded, that it could now be only a matter of days or weeks before the Allies would have landed sufficient forces to be able to mount an attack on Paris, and finally on the German Reich. If it were not for that damned air superiority. Even by night Christmas trees hung in the sky bathing the whole area in bright light. The air attacks never stopped. The Navy laid a barrage of fire on our positions and bombarded the city of Caen, which was a focal point in our lateral communications. By day it was even worse. At any movement on the battlefield, even of an individual vehicle, the enemy reacted with concentrated fire from the Navy or attacks by fighter bombers. Either our radio communications were being intercepted or the Navy had divided up the whole area into grid squares and had only to pass on the square number to launch a sudden concentration of fire. Against such concentrations, and for the night, we all dug foxholes beside our vehicles, which provided some protection. All our supplies came from the Paris area and could be moved only by night. During the night of the 7th of June I received orders to continue the attacks on Esquivel also on the following days. We must try to crush the bridgehead east of the Ohm, which as yet is small, was the message from our divisional commander. Then, in the morning, we saw on the rising ground north of Esquivel up to 100 gliders lying in the fields, a sign that further units of the 6th Airborne Division had landed. Units of the Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion were still dug in on the southern edge of Esquivel. A combat patrol forced its way into the village and suffered heavy losses, but brought out 13 prisoners. One of them talked. We had the task of attacking southward through Esquivel, to extend the bridgehead and reach our original objective. We are only waiting for reinforcements. Back at my command post, I got into conversation with an NCO of the 6th Airborne Division. He was slightly wounded and was just being treated by our doctor. He thanked us for his fair treatment, but was somewhat embittered. I belonged to B Company under Major John Howard. We had the task of landing at midnight with 6 gliders by the 2 Ohm bridges near Bénouville and taking the bridges intact. We had been trained for this operation for over a year. We landed right by the bridges. The enemy were taken completely by surprise. They did not even have time to carry out the prepared demolitions. I think we were the very first to land on French soil. We were mighty proud, especially since we had only a few casualties. Major Howard had told us that after the operation had succeeded we would be flown back to England, to be held in readiness for another action. Then, yesterday evening, our major received orders to attack the village of Esquivel this morning. The little bridgehead had to be extended. A task for which, in my opinion, we were never intended. We forced our way into the village, but came under heavy fire from all sides, especially from your bloody 88s. I believe more than half our company have been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. After the feeble resistance at the bridges we seem to have stumbled here on a strong, battle-tried opponent. Our major was so proud of the coup de main. And now this disaster. All the same, we know our landing from the sea has been successful. You can't stop us anymore from marching on Paris before long. You can't win this war anymore. One of the bridges is known today as Pegasus Bridge. so called after the flying horse emblem of the British airborne forces. Meanwhile, reports were coming in from our right flank. My battalion was engaged in heavy defensive fighting, especially on the right flank near and north of Troarn. On no account must the enemy break through there on our unprotected, open flank. On the 7th of June its commander, Captain Curzon, was killed. He was promoted posthumously to major and awarded the Knight's Cross. Lieutenant Brandenburg, who with his No. 5 company had been the first to make contact with the enemy during the night of the 6th dot, was also killed. Both were buried in ground to the rear and later re-entered. These were heavy losses for us all. Division sent Major Kurz of the reserve that same day as the new commander of the battalion. He was an infantryman and had been in Russia. In that respect he was very suitable for the immediate task. Within a short while he had integrated himself and became one of my most reliable and successful leaders in the combat group. On the 8th of June neither we nor the British attacked. On both sides the wounded had to be cared for and casualties replaced. To our surprise a few Messerschmitts suddenly appeared. They were at once involved in an air battle. An RAF fighter was shot down over the British lines. The men all raised their arms in jubilation. Were the promised 1,000 fighters about to turn up after all? But a Messerschmitt was also shot down. The pilot was able to save himself by parachute and landed near the reconnaissance battalion. He was brought along to me. He swore and waved his arms about. What are we supposed to do with a couple of fighters against this superiority? Where the hell are the 1,000 fighter planes? We did not know either. In the afternoon Major Waldo reported back from leave. His men of the reconnaissance battalion were glad. He was very popular, especially as he stuck up for them and always tried to avoid unnecessary losses. At the same time as Waldo came, an order also came from Division. Von Luck's combat group will assemble on the morning of the 9th of June for a decisive attack on Esquivel, advance on Ranville, and take possession of the Ulm bridges. Assigned to it for this purpose will be Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 21, No. 4 Company of Panzer Regiment 22, 3 batteries of Major Becker's Assault Gun Battalion 200, and 1 company of Anti-Tank Battalion 220 with 8.8 cm guns. The division's artillery will support the attack within the limits of its supply of ammunition. Late that evening all the commanders, along with an artillery observer, gathered at my post. We assemble before dawn, before the enemy air force can intervene or the navy be effective. The motorcycle escorts of the reconnaissance battalion and the grenadier of 11 Battalion not tied down by the enemy will lead, followed by battalion, and supported by the tanks of No. 4 Company, as well as Becker's SPWS. The 8.8 cm anti-tank guns will take up positions on the hill south of Esquivel, to ward off counterattacks by British tanks. It would take a powerful and effective combat group to offset the impact of the naval guns and fighter bombers. We assembled an hour before dawn. I traveled with a little command group behind the reconnaissance battalion, so that I could make decisions on the spot. During the night we had been plastered with heavy naval fire and bombs. Our preparations had evidently been spotted. Lance Corporal Hamill, who took part in the attack as a motorcycle escort, recalls, with support from the tanks and assault guns we soon forced our way into Esquivel. The remaining civilian population had gathered by the church. We found a few children running around looking for their parents. We took them to the church. The British of the 6th Airborne Division put up fierce resistance. When it became light, heavy fire from the Navy began to fall on the center of the village and its southern edge. We could make no progress. Then the news reached us that our beloved commander, Major Waldo, had been killed, only a day after coming back from his wife. This was a blow to us all. We could not even recover his body at first because of the barrage of fire. It was not until after dark that a patrol of volunteers, whom the British in fairness allowed to pass, was able to bring Major Waldo back and bury him further to the rear. Later the British transferred him to their military cemetery in Ranville, where he found his last rest among his former enemies. Waldo's death greatly affected me personally. During the course in Paris I had often had talks with him from which I could infer his contempt for Hitler. As I heard later, he had belonged to the wide circle of the men of the 20th of July 1944. I had told Wido of Rommel's prophecy. He too had set his hopes on Rommel. Waldo was an officer of the old Prussian school, highly decorated in Russia, modest and always considerate of the welfare of his men. His sister told me later, for example, that he had once been in a Russian village surrounded by partisans. The inhabitants had had nothing to eat for days. Waldo thereupon distributed his men's rations among the women and children. During the night a deputation of partisans suddenly appeared. "German, you have given our women and children food. Spasibo, thank you. For that you may leave the village tonight with your men. We will not attack." A sign of humanity on both sides. Captain Brandt from the division's reserve of officers took over the reconnaissance battalion in place of Waldo. For Wemmer Kortenhaus, too, at that time a tank commander in No. 4 Company, the 9th of June became a nightmare. That day was for us one of the hardest actions ever. We assembled with about 10 tanks under the trees of the avenue south of Esquivel. We drove with closed ports, one tank after the other, to the fight past the chateau into a large meadow, which was enclosed by hedges. There we intended switching to broad wedge formation for attack, the grenadier behind and alongside us. Then everything happened very quickly. Within a few minutes we had lost 4 tanks, knocked out by the naval guns. On my tank a Mk4 with the short barrel the turret jammed, so that I could only shoot into the hedges with my machine gun. The fire became more intense, so that on orders from Major von Luck we had to withdraw, as did the grenadier. The artillery fire continued unabated. Some 30 or 40 grenadier must have been killed by it. On the evening of that the 9th of June we realized that we could no longer drive the British back into the sea. In 1960, when the ruins of the chateau were still standing, I went over the action again on the spot. Our attack could not have succeeded, for behind the hedge was a solid wall, which we could have broken through with our tanks only at the risk of disadjusting our guns. In front of the wall was a ditch very convenient for the elements defending themselves there. And in the wall there were holes, made by artillery shells, through which the defenders could easily retreat. For us, therefore, it was an unfavorable sector for a tank attack. From the reports of patrols it appeared that on the 8th of June the 51st Highland Division had been moved into the bridgehead to relieve the hard-pressed 6th Airborne. With that the likelihood of pushing back the bridgehead was further reduced. I knew the 1st Highland Division from North Africa. It had been regarded even then as an experienced elite unit. To my surprise a combat patrol came back one day with a man on a DKW motorcycle. I looked at the machine. It was painted khaki and bore the sign of my reconnaissance battalion 3 on its mudguard. This machine had been through its own little safari. It had been captured by the British in North Africa, shipped to England and from there sent to Normandy, where my men recaptured it and returned it to me intact. Meanwhile, during the nights of 7 and the 8th of June, the 2 panzer divisions, the Panzer Lehr Division and the 12th SS Panzer Division, having arrived at the invasion front after hard and costly marches from their concentration areas far to the east and south of Caen, had been thrown into counterattacks and defensive fighting west of Caen. But they, too, decimated and unnerved by the constant attacks of the RAF, were no longer able to make any impression on the bridgeheads west of Caen and were stuck. Hitler now seemed to grasp that this was the invasion and not a diversionary maneuver, but he would still not rule out a further operation in the Pas-de-Calais. As Rommel told me on one of his visits to the front, he had begged Hitler orally and in writing to come to the front and form for himself an idea of the situation and the mood of the men. That seemed to us the least one might expect from an army Führer. Instead, he issued his orders from Obersalzberg. There we had to give credit to Churchill, who came to the invasion front, showed himself to his men, and gave them heart. According to one of Hitler's orders, no division might be sent into action without his personal order. Not only Rommel but all of us were depressed that Hitler viewed the situation far too optimistically and juggled with divisions and army corps of which only decimated elements remained. The morale of the men was still surprisingly good, although all realized that Allied success in the West meant the end. The employment of Vi and later V2 rockets, and the announcement of new miracle weapons, gave the men some hope of a turn for the better. For the 12th of June, Division issued another order to attack. The village of St. Honorin, lying on a commanding hill, was to be won back, to give us a view over the enemy battlefield and deny the British a view of our own positions. My combat group was to be further reinforced. A brigade of multiple rocket launchers, Moaning Minis, with over 300 tubes 21 cm and 30 cm in caliber, was to support us. These launchers had a particular psychological effect. The projectiles flew over the battlefield with a loud, nerve-shattering whine and forced the surprised enemy to take cover immediately. with the 2 motorcycle companies of the Reconnaissance Battalion and some Grenadier of I Battalion on foot, supported by the few operational tanks of No. 4 Company and Becker's assault guns, we moved against St. Honorin shortly before dawn after heavy and concentrated fire by the rocket launchers. We took our opponents, elements of a Canadian division, by surprise, and they gave up the village at once. I went in close behind the motorcycles and saw the enemy lines for the first time. Hundreds of gliders were lying on the ground. We dug ourselves in at once on the northern edge of the village, to secure the hill for ourselves. Then began the heaviest naval bombardment we had known so far. We could see the firing of the battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The shells, of calibers up to 38 centimeters, came whistling over like heavy trunks, to burst and rip vast craters in our lines. British fighter bombers swooped down on us unhindered. A veritable inferno broke over our heads. Then, taking advantage of the haze and dust of the explosions, the Canadians came back and after hand-to-hand fighting, with heavy losses on both sides, forced us to give up the village again. What more could we set against this superiority in naval guns and fighter bombers? We now finally gave up hope of making any impression on the British bridgehead, let alone of eliminating it. We realized how important this bridgehead was on our unprotected right flank. As Lance Corporal Hamill was later to relate, the barrage of fire on St. Honorin was the worst that we had experienced so far. We prayed. When we had pulled back to the village of Couvreville, a few kilometers further south, another heavy barrage of fire rained down on that village. Was there absolutely nowhere left here where one could get a breather and some sleep? One result at least came of our frequent attacks and patrolling activities. The British began to mine themselves inside the lines they had reached. This was a sure sign that for the moment they had no intention of launching further attacks. For a few weeks we had some peace in my sector. Patrols alone were deployed time and again, to put out feelers. Only once more, on the 15th of June, with heavy artillery support, did we try to attack Esquivel, for this was the key position in order to recapture the Orne bridges. But this attack too was in vain and brought heavy losses to both sides. Nor would the situation change for us all the time we were within range of the naval guns and the enemy had absolute control of the air. The brave, hard-hit Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion 21 was pulled out on the 16th of June, but up to the 29th of June still had to ward off enemy attempts on the eastern edge of Caen to take possession of Caen and the Orne bridges there. On the 30th of June, the battalion was moved to the area south of Caen, to be restored to strength. On a visit to my command post, General Feuchtinger told me that the British and Americans had occupied firm, if sometimes small bases along the whole invasion front. There is no doubt that the Allies are bound to try, somewhere and sometime, to break out of the beachheads, if the invasion is not to have been in vain. Our weak point is our right flank, your sector, my dear Luck. South and east of you there are no reserves. The one advantage for you is that the terrain between the Ohm and the overflowing dives is so narrow that one division at most can attack out of the bridgehead. For that, however, we must be prepared, so you will be receiving further reinforcements and will set up a graduated defense in depth. The terrain is certainly suitable for a tank attack, but with its many villages, hedges, and bits of woodland it's even better tank-killing country. Your task remains unchanged, to prevent any breakout or breakthrough from the bridgehead to the south or southeast. June went by. July was particularly hot. We all suffered from the mosquitoes. Some people had to receive medical treatment for their swollen eyes. The corn was high and ripe, but the peasants no longer dared to go into the fields for fear of being taken for an enemy and shot. Almost every day 11 Battalion had to resist the attacks of strong assault groups and suffered heavy losses in the process. One hot morning, when I was observing the front with Major Kurz, a sniper's shot went through my cap. A bit of luck. At the beginning of July, the enemy suddenly attacked. Operation Epsom was started. The British were fond of naming their operations after British racecourses. The enemy tried to break through just west of the Ohm, in the sector of Regiment 192. It was the LLTH Armoured Division under Major General Pip Roberts, probably the youngest but most experienced tank commander. I knew Pip Roberts from North Africa, where he had led the tank brigade of the famous 7th Armoured Division. His ILTH Armoured Division, on the other hand, was newly formed and inexperienced. As almost always with the British, they carried out their tank attacks without accompanying infantry. As a result, They were unable to eliminate at once any little anti-tank nests that were lying well camouflaged in woodland or behind hedges. The main attack broke down under our defensive fire, although on the flank British and Canadian infantry were able to force their way into the western part of Caen. Our front still held. As announced by Fought.the, my combat group was considerably strengthened at the beginning of July. Tiger Battalion 503 was transferred to my sector. Because of its dreaded 88 and its heavy armor, the Tiger was regarded as invulnerable and superior to all enemy tanks. Major Becker, with all 5 companies of his assault gun battalion 200, was attached to me and was to work closely with the Grenadier. I was given the remaining battalion of our Panzer regiment. The other battalion had been transferred to Germany to re-equip with the Panzer V Panther. A detachment of rocket launchers was attached to me. A battalion of the Luftwaffe's Field Division No. 16 came under my command, to form a weak line in front of my positions. A battalion of the Luftwaffe's Field Division No. 16 came under my command, to form a weak line in front of my positions. As Fought.the had told me, on and behind the hills at Bourguibus 3 anti-tank sections with 8.8 cm guns were being brought into position. Added to these was the division's artillery. My 2 battalions 1 by 125 and 2 by 125 were posted to the left and right behind the Luftwaffe's field units in so-called block positions, from which they could either launch a counterattack or set up a defensive front. With them were Major Becker's companies. We thus set up a graduated defense about 15 kilometers in depth, which would be able, sooner or later, to bring any enemy attack to a standstill. Despite intensive aerial reconnaissance, the British failed to detect this echelon defense in depth. As we discovered later, they reckoned on a depth of only 7 kilometers. From captured maps we found that the British had assumed there were at least 2 if not 3 German panzer divisions in the sector of their attack. This overestimate may have been the reason for their cautious advance later. In spite of strong protests from the corps commander and infantrymen, the 2 panzer battalions were placed close behind the most forward positions. It would have been better to have held them further back in readiness for counterattacks. This decision was later to prove disastrous. In the late afternoon of the 14th of July, I was summoned to the HQ of Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, our recently appointed corps commander. Sepp Dietrich knew me from the time I had asked him for advice about my problem of marriage to Dagmar. He had received the curious answer from Hitler's HQ for his part with sheer disbelief, and so had promised to make direct representations. Owing to the heavy fighting that set in, this remained unfortunately only an intention. Also at the corps command post, where Sepp Dietrich greeted me, was Fought.the. "Luck," said Dietrich. "In the 6 weeks since the landing you have led your combat group with distinction and prevented an early breakthrough by the British on our threatened eastern flank. Your commander has put you in for the Knight's Cross. I know also that tomorrow is your birthday and that your flank 6E works in Paris. To give you a few days' rest, I have decided to send you instead of one of my staff officers a special mission to Paris. You will leave tonight and return early on the 18th. I wish you happy days." "Obergruppenführer," I cried. "I can't accept this, tempting though it is. I can't leave my men on their own in this critical situation. I reckon the British will try their next breakout, or even breakthrough, in my sector. Thank you for the offer, but let me stay here, please." "Luck," replied Sepp Dietrich. "According to our information there's little likelihood of a fresh attack for the next 10 to 14 days. After their costly Epsom offensive, the British will first have to regroup and build up appropriate supplies, so it's all right to go." I finally let myself be persuaded, after prompting also from Fought.the. The prospect of seeing Dagmar again was too enticing. When I returned to my command post, I went to I Battalion and told its commander to take over leadership of the combat group during my absence. My Mercedes was brought forward and loaded with the treasures of Normandy. Via the army telephone system I had myself. I switched into the local civilian network in Paris and told Dagmar and the femme de chambre of my coming. It was with mixed feelings that I left my command post. For security reasons, and to keep an eye on the air I took a driver with me. Before me lay 3 days in Paris. After I had completed my mission and paid a short visit to our special HQ Paris, I was free for Dagmar and my friends. Dagmar and I were more in love than ever, even though the fool regulations and racial laws prevented us from marrying. We promised to wait for each other until after the war and then marry. The foodstuffs I had brought with me, a total of about 50 kilograms, caused great delight all around, but especially the 2 kilos of coffee, for it was no longer obtainable in Paris. "We live here on ersatz," said JB. "We have borrowed that wretched word from you." Despite the pleasure of our reunion, I was uneasy. I telephoned division every day. "All quiet here. Pretty normal. No noticeable change in the situation," I was told each time. I talked over again with Dagmar and my Freefids what was to be done if Paris should be threatened.